You're listening to Working in Oncology, a podcast and video show that spotlights oncology practice staff and industry influencers who work behind the scenes to shape the future of oncology. The more knowledge the oncology community shares with each other, the more we all grow. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Working in Oncology. I'm your co-host for the day, Alicia Evans. I'm joined today by Dr. Ajeet Gajra, Chief Medical Officer at Cardinal Health Specialty Solutions and co-author of a recent study published in JCO Oncology, exploring requests for access to experimental drugs. Dr. Gajra, we thank you for coming to the show today and welcome.
Alicia, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here and very eager to talk about this important but often ignored topic.
Absolutely. So I've been really looking forward to our conversation. Your study was pretty eye-opening, and I think you can really help kind of fill in some knowledge gaps today that will help our listeners really expand their patients' access potentially to experimental drugs.
Sure.
So before we jump into the conversation, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about you, your background, and what you do?
Sure, Alicia. So in my current role, I serve as a Chief Medical Officer here at Cardinal Health Specialty Solutions. And I've been here over 2 years now. But at heart, I'm a clinical, medical oncologist and hematologist. And the start of the journey was back, at the risk of dating myself, back in the late 90s, when I chose the field of hematology oncology to pursue after internal medicine training, because I always thought, oncology is the ultimate barrier, sort of. And others have since written about the cancer being the emperor of all maladies, and I felt like that is so true, or at least was so true to me back in the day. This field has been very gratifying because it's afforded me my three loves, which is clinical research, education, and of course patient care, which is close to my heart. And I was able to serve veterans by working part-time at the VA Medical Center. I've spent most of my time in academic practice, though, until about 2017, when I made a transition to industry focused on clinical research, and then here at Cardinal, continuing that kind of work.
Wow, it seems like you've had kind of an extensive oncology kind of range of experiences.
Certainly, and at the clinical practice, even though it was an academic practice, I had the opportunity to work in a community setting, in a large tertiary care cancer center, and like I said, also in a different system, which the VA system is a unique system. So I had the benefit of all three, and being able to compare and contrast almost with the good bad of each of those.
Awesome. So before we jump into what we want to talk about today is your recent research on the use of expanded access and right to try requests. And I hope you can clear up some misconceptions about the two programs and maybe discuss maybe the ins and outs of each.
Sure. Yeah, so, this is interesting because while in practice, and currently I'm not in active practice, I see patients in a very limited basis, but I had the opportunity to be exposed to and work with the expanded access program myself. In fact, the first time I used it, it was for a patient who had a rare form of lung cancer who had run through all of their treatment options. But the patient and the family still wanted to try something else. And so looking through the clinical trials website, I found that there was a drug which was being tested, but was not FDA approved, not available. So then I was able to reach out to the manufacturer who was willing to, give out the drug for this patient. And but we had to jump through several hoops. So we had to first and foremost get clearance from our institutional review board for protection of patients' best interest, and then we had to submit a request to the FDA. So this in effect sums up the expanded access program, where a drug which is available, it may also be used in other settings, but can be tried in an indication or in a disease where it's not currently approved, but you have to get your IRB approval and you have to get an FDA sign off. And of course the manufacturer, the biopharma company, has to be willing to offer this drug to the patient. Of course, there's an informed consent process. So this expanded access program has been in parlance, has been in use since the late 80s, 1987, I believe, and has helped literally hundreds of thousands of patients gain access to agents outside of a clinical trial, that they might not have had access to. But again, if you're a busy provider, as many of our listeners might be, it seems daunting. Oh, for a single patient, I have to go to my IRB. I have to go to the FDA. This seems like I just don't have the time to do it. But it is very feasible. It's doable. And of course, once you learn how to do it, and the more support you have within your institutional practice, the better you can do it. Now, fast forward to 2018, a new methodology or a new process, new pathway was signed into law called the right to try. And the difference between expanded access and right to try really is that with right to try, you don't have to go to the IRB, you don't have to go through the FDA sign off. So obviously it's a much abbreviated process. However, the manufacturer still has to be willing to provide the drug. And also there are very clear and strict criteria for what patient, what individual can qualify for right to try. So for that, really, three things have to be met in terms of their disease. So they have to have a life-threatening disease. They have to have used up all available and FDA-approved therapies. They cannot, they should not either qualify for a clinical trial or should not have access to one. And of course, they still have to provide written informed consent. So those are sort of the patient essentialities to qualify for right to try. But then there's also the other conditions that have to be met, which are for the drug. So number one, phase 1 studies should have been completed because we want to make sure that we at least have a dose which has been identified, and that safety has been assessed, and it's proven to be safe for use in humans. So phase 1 testing should have been done. This agent, if anyone's going to apply for right to try, could not have been approved or licensed by the FDA for any use. So it's not like, okay, I have this drug, it works in lung cancer, can I use it in breast cancer? No, if it's FDA approved already, then you cannot access it by right to try. And the third is that the manufacturer should have already filed an IND application with the FDA, which of course is standard, but there cannot be a clinical hold. So sometimes the FDA will notice that, there's maybe a problem or maybe a safety signal or some concern with an agent as it's being developed. And so they might put a clinical hold on the IND. So again, so if there's a clinical hold, then that drug cannot be accessed through right to try. And again, it's to safeguard the patient's interest, because the FDA has put a hold on it for a reason, and for safety or some other concern. And so then we don't want to unknowingly expose a patient to such harms. So I know, long answer. But
so that's an overview of these two, expanded access and right to try. There are some other terms that come up sometimes. Compassionate use.
Yes. So, you bring up a very valid point, Alicia. So compassionate use has been long used, quite honestly, to describe the expanded access program, because what we were doing through that was helping, and still are, is, and when I say we, I mean as oncologists, as fellow oncologists, it is a method of getting access to a drug which is not approved or indicated by the label in a given patient's condition. So if a drug is approved for, I'll give you an example. When you're an oncologist, and all of our listeners know that, neighbors, friends, family all reach out to you. So, there's someone that reached out. Unfortunately, they have a brain tumor, they have a brain cancer, a glioblastoma, and they have, already used up the 2 to 3 standard treatment options. So they really want to try immunotherapy. So, but immunotherapy is expensive and it's not approved for glioblastoma. So they are obtaining this immunotherapy medication via an expanded access program. So in a way, it is compassionate use, but because the manufacturer is willing to provide that. But right to try, in a way, is also a form of compassionate use. So I guess my point is that compassionate use is a broad term utilized for off-label, which is another term, use of these drugs which are not approved by the FDA for a given disease. But again, they have to be provided by the manufacturer. And I think that is a part of the compassionate use is coming from that, the manufacturer is willing to provide access to these agents.
Okay. And so this kind of brings us back to your research. And I mean, we've already established that these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, mistakenly. And in your research, I was very surprised to find that such a small percentage of patients, of providers had attempted the right to try pathway.
Yes, and Alicia, so that was a part of the reason why we conducted this. So in my role here at Cardinal, I support also one of the divisions called Cardinal Health Regulatory Sciences. So there's a whole, a great team of scientists and pharmacists and other regulatory specialists in that division that work with FDA and other agencies to get a drug from the pre-IND, IND to final approval stage. So anyway, so as you pointed out, there's even in people who are very well versed with this work, there can sometimes be confusion in terms of off-label, compassionate use, and then EAP, expanded access and right to try. So through our summits, so Cardinal conducts summits, meetings of providers, physicians, but also sometimes APPs like MPs and PAs. But this survey was directed towards physicians to assess if they understand the differences between right to try and expanded access. Now, even though we conducted this late 2019 to early 2020, perhaps we were not even thinking about publishing this. But then, unfortunately, as we all know, the pandemic happened. And as we know, the access to medication, in this case, antiviral therapy, or what was hoped to be antiviral therapy, that we heard so much about compassionate use of various drugs for COVID-19. And so that made us think like, we had the information already. So in fact, that was a reason for us to go ahead and publish our findings or report our findings amongst oncologists, even though this is directed towards oncology drugs. But we also, in our work and our research, realized that this hasn't been done for community-based oncologists in the past. And really, those were the reasons to report this in JCO oncology practice.
So in summary, what you're researching, research rather, is kind of an assessment of physicians' knowledge of these programs and their experience with each of these programs.
Exactly. So knowledge and utilization. So do they know about this? Have they utilized it? And we also wanted to ask them if they've utilized it, what is their success rate? Are they able to gain access with the drug that they requested or not? So, and again, in the spirit of full disclosure, we say that clearly in our paper, this is simply based on a survey or on recall. So it's not like we're asking them for, specific evidence like, oh, show me the number of times you did this. But, what was their overall impression?
Yeah. And so on the results, I see that about 46 of your physicians, 46%, excuse me, had actually attempted the EA program, while really surprisingly, only 14% tried the right to try program or attempted.
Right. Yes, Alicia. So, I mean, part of it is because expanded access has been there for so long. It's been there for literally dozens of years since 1987, whereas Right to Try is very new. I will say, though, Right to Try has garnered a lot of media attention, even while it was a bill and it was being discussed on the floor of the Congress, and to the time that it was signed into law. There's been a lot of media attention on this, but you're right. Despite that, it was a little surprising that less than half of the physicians had access or tried to utilize EAP, which has been there for whatever 40 years or 35 years, and only 14%, like you said, had attempted to use the Right to Try.
And so you think that some of it is attributed to Right to Try being just a kind of a newer program?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it seemed that the success rates were slightly bigger, of course, for expanded access, since you had more attempted than the Right to Try. Is that correct too?
Yes, remarkable success rate. So for those that used expanded access, almost 90%, so 89% were successful in gaining access to the drug that they requested. So this is pretty impressive. And then with Right to Try was slightly lower. It was somewhat lower at 73%, but still not something to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't. I mean, it's remarkable that 3/4 of the time you're successful. And mind you, neither of these programs, neither the EAP nor the Right to Try, mandate the manufacturers to give out, the drug that's requested. So it's completely up to the manufacturer whether they want to give this drug out or not. But if you're getting access to a drug 90% of the time, that's quite a remarkable statistic in my mind.
It seems remarkable to me. So what do you think are some barriers? Is it just the knowledge, or are these programs difficult to access?
I think you're right on both fronts. So what our takeaway was, so we had some questions buried in our survey to assess if the physicians are able to distinguish between the two programs.
Mhm.
And only about a fourth of them, so 27% of them, correctly identified that for Right to Try, you bypass the IRB and you bypass the FDA. So the vast majority actually didn't realize that that was a major difference. The other thing that we asked to assess, to gauge their knowledge and awareness was for the expanded access, which requires FDA sign off, I would say, or FDA review. How often do you think FDA signs off or approves an expanded access request? And only 3% came up with the correct answer. So believe it or not, the FDA has approved 99% of the requests for expanded access, and only 3% of respondents actually gave us the right answer, that over 95% of the time FDA approves that. So which again tells you that there's just lack of awareness. And then we also asked them, how often, how many patients do you think? And mind you, this was only a year into Right to Try, because the survey started in the fall of 2019, whereas the Right to Try legislation was passed in 2018. So we asked them, how many patients do you think thus far have benefited from Right to Try? And again, only about 11% were able to guess the correct answer. So there's definitely, some lack of understanding, and you brought up valuable terms in terms of, I think it all gets muddled sometimes in people's heads, but also the process has been daunting for expanded access, and with Right to Try, it's much simpler.
Okay. Oh, wow. Oh, really? So it seems like expanded access will require more support.
Correct.
Than a Right to Try program. Okay.
Because you would have to go to your IRB and you have your own IRB sign off. Now, to facilitate expanded access use and utilization, the FDA had actually made it much simpler. In the past, up until 2015, I believe, for expanded access, the entire IRB, so the entire board had to approve an expanded access request. But to simplify, because a lot of times, these requests are coming in dire circumstances, or when unfortunately a patient has limited time, perhaps. So the FDA modified that guidance and said that expanded access can be granted by one IRB member. So if you want to access something urgently, even one single IRB member can authorize or approve an expanded access request. But still, there's multiple steps. There's IRB, then going to the FDA. The FDA application is long. I'll tell you, I've done it myself. But the reassuring thing is they do respond very quickly. The median time to response, I think, is 3 to 4 days at the FDA. And like I said, they do approve majority. They have approved majority of the request. Of course, the physician, like all of our listeners here, have to make sure that they are trying to do the right thing for the patient. We don't want to just throw something and see if it sticks. But if there's some scientific rationale and it makes sense, then it's definitely worth pursuing.
Exactly. So if how do our listeners begin the process? So let's start with expanded access. What would be the first step to take?
Right. So again, even for expanded access, suppose we have a patient who unfortunately is progressing through available treatment options, but and maybe there's an ongoing clinical trial, but the patient may not qualify because of certain underlying conditions, or they may just not be able to travel to a far off institution to participate and such. And generally, most oncologists are aware of other agents which are being tested in a given disease. Otherwise, they can use resources like clinicaltrials.gov that lists all of the trials ongoing in a disease. And so if you identify a drug or that may potentially benefit your patient. Also, the patient has to be in reasonable condition. If someone's very very frail, or that what we say performance status is very poor, that may not be the best candidate, because at the end of the day, we don't want to harm the patient. But there are some patients who are in reasonable performance status, and some of them can be robust. So it's very simple. I would first start with making an outreach to the manufacturer and saying, I have such and such patient, and might I have access under expanded access? By the way, there's now legislation that requires manufacturers to list on their website whether they offer expanded access program or not. And by making an outreach to them, so they may say yes. If that is it, then that's my green light. I go to my IRB with my case history and say, here's the circumstance, here's the data for the drug. Would you approve this? Assuming they approve that, simultaneously, I will complete my whatever it is 6-page FDA application and send that packet off with my IRB approval and redacted patient history and why it's appropriate for that patient. I would send that to the FDA, expect a response within a week. And then with those 3 things, I will go to the manufacturer. And like I said, I've been through this myself several times, and then you get your shipment. Of course, there still has to be an informed consent for the patient, because you're giving them an agent that we don't know how they might react to. But that's the job of the IRB, to make sure that you have a proper informed consent in place. So, and then you start. So that would be the EAP program, right to try. And I had sort of left full-time practice by the time this legislation came out, so I cannot claim to have first-hand experience with this. But again, here, I think very often what I'm noticing is that it's more driven by the patient, but the patient cannot do it themselves, because they have the physician, and even the FDA guidance says that the physician is the best person to decide, whether this drug may be beneficial, or that some benefits may outweigh harms, because it's not like every patient has the right to try any drug for anything. So the drug already should be purposed, even though not approved, for their condition. And like we went over the criteria before, really the application on the FDA website is quite simple. But again, the manufacturer cannot be mandated. And again, my suggestion would be reach out to the manufacturer first, ask if they're willing to share the drug, through a right to try mechanism. If they deny, then it's not worthwhile going through the extra steps. And sometimes you'll come across a manufacturer will say, we cannot do right to try, but we can do expanded access. So then you might have to take the longer pathway, but you can still have access to the agent.
Okay, so for both approaches, you would go to the manufacturer first.
I would. I think that way, yeah, that would streamline your efforts, and that way you're not trying to, walk down a path that's going to lead to nowhere.
Yes. And it sounds like right to try, especially because there's been kind of recent press and it's kind of a new process. These are often patient initiated requests.
Very true, Alicia. So you will see a lot of stories, and some of them, of course, very heartrending, but of advocacy, and especially when there are children involved and such, and especially with rare diseases. I mean, here we're talking about cancer, but then there are other diseases. There's muscular dystrophy, there's spinal muscular atrophy, all kinds of other neurological and other conditions that predominantly affect children or even newborns. And you see a lot of stories, of parents trying to make this kind of outreach. So, but yes, a lot of times it is, I find the patient, the family who's sort of driving this, but then the physician and the team has to support them and also guide them, what may not be appropriate at all.
Of course, the physician needs to be as deeply involved in the process, and the whole care team really in these decisions. So our oncology office staff is very busy. Things are always moving. There's always changing parts. How can they stay up to date on these processes? What do you recommend?
Right. So I feel as though, it's somewhat easier for practices and physicians and teams and, offices which are already involved in research. I think that makes the process a lot simpler, because many of these steps you're doing for participation in clinical trials anyway. Now, with right to try, I don't believe that you can do that for every patient every time, but there can be select circumstances where it makes a lot of sense to try and pursue, a treatment option for a given patient. Certainly, I haven't forgotten my full-time practice days. I'm very cognizant of how, the amount of clinical workload and workflow responsibilities that lie on the oncologist, research team, office staff, the entire team. And so this certainly would add more work to what they're trying to do. But I feel it's to the same order as it is to enroll a patient on a clinical trial, because especially even those activities take a lot of time and effort. So I believe, in my mind, the widget of work that's involved is about the same as enrolling a patient on a treatment trial.
Okay. So it's not an overwhelming, it's a standard.
Of course, if there were a lot of patients like that, it would get overwhelming, but that's why you have to pick and choose, who the program might actually work for.
And then another piece that came up in your research that I was curious about is, can these requests be made for a small population of patients? So I say I have 3 or 4 patients in the same situation. Can I make one request for all of them? And is that possible for both programs?
Great question, Alicia. So this is possible for the expanded access program, not for the right to try program. The right to try is an individual based program based on individual need. But for expanded access, yes, it is possible to, request it for a small group of patients.
Understand. Okay. Do you have any helpful tips for office staff as they are filling out this document? Any tips on how to communicate with patients while they're going through this process, which I'm sure is very stressful for all parties involved?
Right. So, I think anyone in oncology and, everyone that touches the patient, starting from, the intake folks to the nurses, to the nurse practitioners, research coordinators, and the back office folks, that may not be meeting the patient, but I think we have to be careful. I feel as though you have to temper the patients' and families' expectations. A lot of times, folks, when unfortunately they're desperate or they're losing hope, they tend to amplify, the possibility of success with anything. So I think, while effort is to be lauded, we cannot obviously, first of all, we cannot guarantee that a medication will become available. Number two, even if it becomes available, it may not work. And number three, not only may not it work, it may cause a serious side effect. So I think counseling the patient, loved ones, family is so critical. And I think the messaging should be uniform across the team, because human nature is such that we always tend to believe the one person who gave us the most hope when we're down or when we're sad. And what you don't want to do is that in this process of, and unfortunately, oncology care or fighting cancer is a emotional roller coaster as it is. So you don't want to get them too high and then let them fall too hard. So it is okay to explain and say that we're going to try this. But we don't know what the outcome is going to be, so that that would be my suggestion to the entire team, so that, and again, if we gain access, that's a good day. And then once, it will have to be another good day after several weeks to see that a medication is working.
Got it. So to have an honest conversation and to temper your excitement of getting the possibility of a new treatment with the realistic outcome.
Correct.
So for someone who has gained access to a drug and has had success, so for either of these programs, how does that success affect the future use of this drug? So does that expand the drug's use like permanently to that population? How does it affect the rollout process?
A great point. So, Alicia, so I think in this regard, the two programs are so different because with the expanded access program, there's a more robust back reporting. So, the reporting in terms of outcomes, in terms of what happens to any given patient is captured much more succinctly and much more consistently. Number one. With the right to try, first of all, the program is very new. Also understand who is the watchdog for all of drug therapy in this country. It's the FDA. And with the right to try program, what did we just say? That you bypass the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
So I think many have criticized the right to try program, saying that there wasn't enough oversight. Of course, the counterpoint is that oversight slows things down, and sometimes these patients don't have that kind of time. So I think both camps have valid arguments, but we have the legislation in the form that we have it. And so with that, I think it's still an open question in terms of how the follow-up is being managed. Currently, there is no, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a consistent way of capturing as to how many patients are benefiting from the right to try program. However, in my reading as of last year, the FDA has instructed manufacturers to report to the FDA, how often are they meeting with the right to try utilization. So right now, what will happen is in any kinds of outcomes follow-up, that those are laid down for right to try by the manufacturer. So what happened, what was the outcome? The manufacturer's capturing it, but doesn't seem to be a consistent way of then putting it into a large national database or what have you. So information is somewhat fragmented. But I feel like that is much better organized with the EAP program because it's just been around longer and a lot of the bugs have been worked out, and also it has more oversight.
Okay, so there's additional reporting hopefully coming in the future, and we can hopefully build off of that.
Correct. And there's been a lot of requests for, by the FDA for transparency, that if the right to try is a good thing and if manufacturers are supporting it, well, then let's get that word out and, put that out in an accessible area or database so that everyone knows what's going on. And to your earlier point about, if there is success, that doesn't automatically obviously expand the label or get FDA approval. But the manufacturer does capture all of those real world examples as case reports and then case series, which can help them, as they are developing the drug further or going to the FDA for final approval. So in the case of, the patient that I mentioned at the beginning, I had obtained a drug called lorlatinib for them, and that drug was in in a developmental stage that only had a number, not even a real name. But since that time, it's been approved, FDA approved for that rare form of ALK positive lung cancer, and is now available for use in public. So, so there are, and even the patient that I mentioned did gain a lot of benefit from that. Ultimately, the cancer unfortunately progressed, but they did it did help them buy time. So all of those anecdotal or case reports, case series kind of get compiled together to indicate success, aside from the work that's going on in a clinical trial.
Excellent. So there is some tracking. Dr. Gajra, this has been a really great conversation. So much insight into into two processes that I think that not everyone has been exposed to. One is actually is pretty recent. For any of our listeners who want to reach out to you with follow-up questions or want to continue the conversation, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. Yeah, Alicia, thank you for having me. But yeah, folks, anyone can reach me. I'm on LinkedIn. It's Ajeet Gajra at LinkedIn. The good thing about having a rare name is there aren't too many of me, so you'll be able to find me easily. Also, I will post a URL that is more at the Cardinal level, but we can certainly, you can gain access through that route as well. But again, I greatly appreciate the opportunity, and for listeners here, hopefully this has helped you somewhat gain some confidence in terms of the two programs because they are talked about quite often.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your insights. I'll be sure to include links to your LinkedIn and also your Cardinal Health website in our show notes. Again, I appreciate you being a guest of the show today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Working in Oncology. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.